Have you ever wondered how ancient biblical prophecies might connect to the conflicts and tensions in the Middle East today, and how these predictions, written thousands of years ago, still influence the thoughts and actions of political and religious leaders in the region? The prophecies about the Euphrates River and Armageddon mentioned in the book of Revelation are references that intrigue scholars and have been interpreted in various ways over time. This theme, both spiritual and geopolitical, stirs curiosity and demands a profound and critical understanding. In this video, we will explore how these prophecies not only have deep roots in historical and religious contexts, but also impact modern tensions in the Middle East. We'll show how the symbolism behind these passages is currently interpreted by influential figures, from religious leaders to heads of state, and how these interpretations shape perceptions, policies, and conflicts. Our goal is to go beyond sensationalism and provide a balanced perspective, allowing viewers to understand the biblical connections with a critical and informed outlook. Join us until the end to gain a broad and well-founded understanding of these prophecies and their repercussions on the global political stage. This is an invitation to discover how religion, history, and politics intertwine, influencing the dynamics of one of the most complex and strategic regions in the world. To understand the role of biblical prophecies about the Euphrates River and Armageddon in the contemporary world, it is essential to grasp the historical and religious contexts in which they were written. These references appear mainly in the book of Revelation, a text known for its symbolic language and visions of the end times. Revelation, attributed to the Apostle John, was written during a period when early Christians faced persecution, and its visions served as messages of hope and resistance in the face of oppression. The Euphrates River, for instance, holds particular importance throughout the Bible. It is repeatedly mentioned in both the Old and New Testaments, with each mention carrying specific symbolism. In the Old Testament, the Euphrates is one of the rivers of the Garden of Eden, symbolizing fertility and abundance. However, it also marks the border between the kingdoms of Israel and Babylon, areas of conflict and exile for the Jewish people. For the Jews, the Euphrates represented both promise and peril. It was the boundary of their lands and a gateway to foreign threats. This ambiguity persists in Revelation, where the river symbolizes a boundary between divine order and the chaos of the external world. The concept of Armageddon, on the other hand, is one of the most recognizable and often misunderstood symbols of the Bible. Armageddon is mentioned only once in Revelation 16:16 and is described as the place where the forces of good and evil will meet for the final battle. The name Armageddon derives from the Hebrew Har Megiddo, or Mount Megiddo, a site of many battles in Israel's history. Megiddo was a battlefield of strategic and bloody conflicts located on a vital military route between the powers of Mesopotamia and Egypt. By evoking Megiddo, Revelation points to the expectation of a decisive clash between divine and evil forces, something John's contemporaries understood well, as these images were part of their historical and cultural imagination. Over the centuries, these references have been interpreted differently by theologians, scholars, and religious leaders. The symbolism of the Euphrates and Armageddon transcends literal meaning, being seen by many as archetypes of spiritual and moral challenges faced by humanity. For others, these symbols predict concrete events that will occur in an uncertain future. During the Middle Ages, apocalyptic visions were often used to explain disasters and conflicts, with wars and plagues seen as signs of the end times. In the Protestant Reformation, some theologians associated the Battle of Armageddon with religious disputes and the need for a purification of faith. In the modern world, the Euphrates and Armageddon have gained additional interpretations, particularly in the context of eschatological theories, those attempting to predict the end of times based on biblical passages. Specifically, Fundamentalist Christian groups have begun interpreting these passages as literal events predicted to occur soon. In these cases, the Euphrates symbolizes a region of conflict that they believe is central to the final developments of human history, while Armageddon is the scene of the apocalyptic confrontation. Additionally, with the rise of dispensationalist interpretations, which gained popularity in the 19th and 20th centuries, the idea of a literal final battle at Armageddon became solidified among religious sectors, promoting a specific reading of Revelation. For these groups, Armageddon and the Euphrates are not just spiritual symbols, but also prophetic events that will specifically unfold in the Middle East. They believe certain signs, such as wars, natural catastrophes, and conflicts between nations, indicate the fulfillment of these prophecies. The Middle East thus became seen as the natural stage for these final events. The geographical location of the Euphrates and the history of conflicts in the region have linked it to a prophetic center. During the Cold War, for instance, Christian apocalyptic theorists viewed the involvement of superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union in Middle Eastern wars as evidence that the prophecies were nearing fulfillment. This view was reinforced by the emergence of Israel as a modern state in 1948, an event many fundamentalist Christians interpreted as the beginning of the countdown to the end of days. These contemporary interpretations persist, with some believing the presence of major powers in the region and recurring conflicts are evidence that the world is approaching a final confrontation as described in the prophecy of Armageddon. However, it is essential to highlight that interpretations vary widely, and not everyone views these passages literally. Many scholars and theologians emphasize that the prophecies should be seen in a symbolic and spiritual context, as reflections on good and evil, morality, and the struggle for faith, rather than precise predictions of future events. This historical and religious understanding of biblical prophecies provides a foundation for exploring how the symbolism of the Euphrates and Armageddon remains influential today. With a clearer view of the roots and interpretations of these passages, we are ready to examine how these symbols are utilized and shaped by contemporary political and religious interests. As we move into the present day, it becomes evident that interpretations of biblical prophecies concerning the Euphrates River and Armageddon continue to shape the perspectives of religious and political leaders. These prophecies are often evoked in public discourse, used as justifications, symbols, or even warnings about what is to come. In the Middle East, a stage of intense geopolitical conflicts and religious disputes, these interpretations of biblical prophecies have significantly influenced how certain events are perceived and how alliances and hostilities develop. In the United States, especially among segments of Christian fundamentalism, the Middle East is seen as the prophetic stage for the events of the end times. Evangelical groups adhering to a dispensationalist view of Scripture believe that the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was the first step toward fulfilling prophecies. For many of these groups, Israel is central to biblical predictions, with the Euphrates River and Armageddon as key points that, according to them, must be closely watched to identify signs of the end times. This perspective has influenced not only the religious base in the United States, but also certain politicians who share this vision and take it into account when shaping Middle East policies. Leaders of Islamic countries, on the other hand, also invoke an apocalyptic and eschatological interpretation, but with a view rooted in Islamic prophecies. In Islam, the great battle of the end times, referred to as al-Malhama al-Kubra, the Great War, includes an apocalyptic scenario similar to the one in Christian traditions, which some leaders believe will occur in locations near the Middle East, including the region of Damascus, close to the Euphrates. This perspective also reinforces perceptions of inevitability and urgency with which some conflicts are addressed in the region. The presence of foreign powers in the Middle East, such as the United States, is seen by some Muslim leaders as a provocation resonating with the idea of an imminent holy war justified by their prophetic interpretations. Within Israel, the prophecy of Armageddon also resonates with certain religious sectors advocating for the complete restoration of Greater Israel, extending its borders to the Euphrates. This vision is particularly controversial and is widely debated both within the country and beyond. Although it does not represent the official stance of the Israeli government, the idea of a prophetic Israel continues to inspire some groups who see the annexation of territories as part of a divine mission and fulfillment of biblical promises. This belief influences not only radical factions within Israel, but also certain Christian groups in the United States who view unconditional support for the State of Israel as a spiritual responsibility. These intersecting visions have profound impacts, particularly on the foreign policies of major powers and strategic security decisions in the Middle East. In the United States, politicians and religious leaders sharing a dispensationalist view often push for a policy of unconditional support for Israel, justifying their positions based on literal interpretations of prophecies. This support is intensified by the notion that any threat to Israel is a threat to the fulfillment of prophecy, and that any ally of Israel is an ally in the fight against evil, as described in biblical texts. This rhetoric was especially evident during the Cold War, when the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was viewed by some as a possible prelude to Armageddon, with the Soviet Union identified as a prophetic threat. Moreover, the political use of prophecies extends to justifying military interventions in the Middle East. The military presence of the United States and its allies in countries like Iraq and Syria, located near the Euphrates, is seen by some as a necessary action to ensure the fulfillment of scriptures and to prevent the advance of forces considered anti-Christian or hostile. While this perspective is not dominant across all political spheres, its influence is noticeable in specific sectors advocating for a foreign policy heavily shaped by religious considerations. The media and social networks have also amplified the reach of these apocalyptic interpretations. In times of crisis, such as the September 11th attacks or the wars in Iraq and Syria, references to Armageddon and the Euphrates gain prominence, sparking waves of discussion and theories. During the Syrian conflict, for instance, theories circulated online claiming that the drying up of the Euphrates was a sign that the final battle was approaching. Although these phenomena have geopolitical and environmental explanations, certain interpretations continue to link them to biblical prophecies, heightening fear and speculation among some religious groups. This contemporary interpretation of biblical prophecies can be seen as a tool of influence. Governments and leaders may use it to justify strategic decisions and shape popular support for actions that might otherwise be questioned or criticized. By aligning certain policies with religious prophecies, these leaders manage to legitimize difficult measures, such as military interventions or unconditional support for specific nations. On the other hand, this approach exacerbates tensions, as opposing groups view such actions as prophetic threats requiring a response. However, the interpretation of these prophecies is not always unanimously accepted and varies across different religious and cultural currents. Many Christian and Jewish scholars and theologians advocate for a symbolic reading of these passages, arguing that Revelation and the prophecies about the Euphrates and Armageddon are metaphors for spiritual and moral conflicts rather than future historical events. This perspective emphasizes that the end times refer to a period of spiritual transformation rather than a literal catastrophe. They argue that the prophecies are, in fact, invitations for deeper reflection on ethical values, faith, and justice. Despite the divergent views, the impact of more literal and apocalyptic interpretations cannot be ignored, especially when used to shape policies and international stances. The vision of an imminent final battle strengthens polarized perceptions and makes the Middle East an arena of conflicting religious expectations. Throughout this video, it becomes clear that these contemporary interpretations are more than mere reflections of scriptures. They are tools that shape policies, determine alliances, and amplify the effects of conflicts already deeply rooted in historical and cultural contexts. With this understanding of how these prophecies influence leaders' perspectives and political decisions in the region, we will now explore the direct impacts of these interpretations on the current geopolitical landscape, particularly how they affect international relations and armed conflicts in the Middle East. In the current geopolitical scenario, the weight of biblical prophecies, such as the Euphrates River and Armageddon, is felt in strategic decisions, international alliances, and the public perception of conflicts in the Middle East. The interpretation of this region as the stage for apocalyptic events predicted in the Bible influences both directly involved nations, such as Israel, Iran, and Syria, and external powers like the United States and Russia. This impact is reinforced by narratives evoking a final battle or sacred conflict in one of the most volatile and contested territories on the planet. In the United States, apocalyptic interpretations have found fertile ground, particularly among conservative religious and political groups. The belief that the Middle East will be the setting for a final battle has underpinned unwavering support for Israel, regarded by many dispensationalists as an essential ally in fulfilling prophecies. This support is not merely symbolic, but translates into financial, military, and diplomatic assistance, ensuring that Israel maintains a prominent position in Middle Eastern geopolitics. Thus, U.S. foreign policy in this region often reflects not only strategic interests, but also the influence of religious groups that view support for Israel as a spiritual obligation. This same concept is evident in how the United States, along with its allies, handles nations like Iran and Syria. Positioned near the Euphrates River, and viewed by some as antagonists in the apocalyptic stage, these nations play a crucial role in prophetic narratives. The historical animosity between the United States and Iran, marked by the Islamic Revolution and Iran's nuclear program, is interpreted by some as preparation for the final events described in Revelation. However, this prophetic reading adds an element of unpredictability and tension, as any conflict involving Iran may be perceived by specific groups as a sign of Armageddon, intensifying the pressure for military responses. For Middle Eastern nations, these prophecies also play an important role in forming alliances and mobilizing popular support. In Iran, for example, religious leaders link resistance against Western powers to a sacred duty, integrating apocalyptic rhetoric into contemporary tensions. The narrative of a great battle against invading forces is used to strengthen internal cohesion and justify regional influence expansion, particularly in Shiite-majority territories. For many Iranian religious and political leaders, involvement in conflicts in Syria and Iraq is not merely about power, but also a quasi-spiritual mission where political battles hold eschatological significance. Israel, on the other hand, finds itself at the center of these prophetic interpretations. As the chosen people in biblical narratives, Israel is often interpreted as the main actor in the unfolding of final events. Some religious and political sectors advocate for territorial expansion and the protection of the land at all costs, arguing that prophecy fulfillment depends on preserving and controlling these areas. This sentiment is bolstered by strategic alliances with powers sharing this vision, creating an atmosphere where sovereignty and defense issues intertwine with the expectation of a prophetic future. Meanwhile, other Arab countries such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt adopt a cautious stance. Although they do not directly share the same apocalyptic views, these countries perceive external influences and religious narratives as risk factors. However, these governments also understand that local populations can be easily mobilized around religious rhetoric, particularly during crises. Thus, it is common for political leaders in these countries to use religious language to justify their alliances and reinforce decisions in contexts highly sensitive to public sentiment. Russia, historically a strategic player in the Middle East, adopts a pragmatic approach while being aware of the apocalyptic connotations associated with the Euphrates and Armageddon. Its alliance with Syria and military involvement in the region are seen by some analysts as attempts to limit Western influence while asserting power. However, by engaging in Middle Eastern conflicts, Russia interacts with groups that hold prophetic views and consider it part of the apocalyptic scenario, adding complexity and geopolitical risks. Although officially secular, Russia recognizes the religious symbolism these alliances evoke and occasionally uses such narratives to solidify its position as an influential power in the region. The geopolitical impact of biblical prophecies extends beyond alliances and international rivalries. It also influences how populations interpret local conflicts and position themselves regarding them. The symbolism of the Euphrates and Armageddon creates an atmosphere of expectation, leading many to see the region's conflicts as signs of an imminent climax. This perspective, partially spread by media and religious leaders, shapes public opinion and may amplify reactions to regional events. For instance, a military escalation is not merely perceived as a political issue, but as a step toward prophetic fulfillment, generating anxiety and even resigned acceptance of certain conflicts. Another factor contributing to the persistence of this geopolitical interpretation is the ease of spreading these ideas through social media. Platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook are rife with end times theories, fueling the imagination of people worldwide. Discussions about the drying of the Euphrates as a sign of the approaching Armageddon gained traction during recent water crises in the Middle East, when users interpreted climatic events as precursors to the final battle. These narratives quickly gain momentum, fostering speculation and a sense of urgency or fatalism regarding regional conflicts. This geopolitical impact of prophecies reinforces perceptions of polarization between nations and religions. Countries are not merely seen as states, but as forces with a predestined role in the final battle, which tends to complicate diplomatic dialogue and peace efforts. When religion becomes a decisive factor in international relations, the room for diplomatic solutions shrinks, as each actor involved sees itself as fulfilling a higher mission. In this context, the Middle East transforms into a spiritual battlefield where political actions are viewed by both leaders and populations as manifestations of a prophetic design. These complex interpretations make the Middle East a stage where religion and politics merge, creating an environment of heightened expectations and tensions. Understanding how these biblical prophecies impact contemporary geopolitics allows us to examine the challenges and controversies generated by speculative interpretations, which often amplify fear and contribute to misinformation. Literal and apocalyptic interpretations of biblical prophecies, especially those involving the Euphrates River and Armageddon, often come with challenges and controversies. These challenges not only complicate objective analyses of Middle Eastern conflicts, but also create an environment ripe for misinformation and fear. In politics and religion, speculative interpretations of prophecies can lead to radical decisions and stances, while in society, these views fuel collective anxiety and resigned acceptance of crises and conflicts. One major issue with speculative interpretations is the tendency to directly link specific events to biblical predictions, without considering the historical and cultural contexts of those passages. For example, the mention of the drying of the Euphrates in Revelation is often tied to climatic phenomena and water management issues in the region. During periods of drought, this passage is brought up to suggest that a prophetic event is unfolding, ignoring the real environmental and political causes behind the water crisis. This correlation is widely disseminated on social media, leading many to believe these events are inevitable and that they are witnessing the first signs of an apocalyptic catastrophe. The issue of droughts and water resources in the Middle East is complex, involving infrastructure challenges, resource policies, and climate change. However, apocalyptic interpretations oversimplify this reality, diverting attention from practical solutions and encouraging a fatalistic outlook. When people believe events like the drying of the Euphrates are signs of an unavoidable plan, there is less pressure to implement conservation policies or promote regional cooperation. This fatalism also impacts local leaders' ability to rally populations around real solutions, as many see the problems as part of a divine plan beyond human intervention. Literal and apocalyptic interpretations of biblical prophecies, especially those involving the Euphrates River and Armageddon, often come with challenges and controversies. These challenges not only complicate objective analyses of Middle Eastern conflicts, but also create an environment ripe for misinformation and fear. In politics and religion, speculative interpretations of prophecies can lead to radical decisions and stances, while in society, these views fuel collective anxiety and resigned acceptance of crises and conflicts. One major issue with speculative interpretations is the tendency to directly link specific events to biblical predictions without considering the historical and cultural contexts of those passages. For example, the mention of the drying of the Euphrates in Revelation is often tied to climatic phenomena and water management issues in the region. During periods of drought, this passage is brought up to suggest that a prophetic event is unfolding, ignoring the real environmental and political causes behind the water crisis. This correlation is widely disseminated on social media, leading many to believe these events are inevitable and that they are witnessing the first signs of an apocalyptic catastrophe. The issue of droughts and water resources in the Middle East is complex, involving infrastructure challenges, resource policies, and climate change. However, apocalyptic interpretations oversimplify this reality, diverting attention from practical solutions and encouraging a fatalistic outlook. When people believe events like the drying of the Euphrates are signs of an unavoidable plan, there is less pressure to implement conservation policies or promote regional cooperation. This fatalism also impacts local leaders' ability to rally populations around real solutions, as many see the problems as part of a divine plan beyond human intervention. In academic and theological circles, there is an ongoing effort to demystify the use of prophecies as justifications for contemporary events. Scholars argue that these prophecies were written in specific historical contexts, reflecting the concerns and challenges of their time, and should not be treated as literal predictions of current events. Historians and biblical scholars emphasize that Revelation was largely a message of hope and resistance for persecuted Christian communities, rather than a detailed description of the future. They warn that literal interpretations distort the original purpose of the text and can lead to negative consequences by fostering unrealistic expectations or fatalistic worldviews. This critique extends to international organizations working for peace and stability in the Middle East. Observing the influence of apocalyptic interpretations on the policies of certain governments and groups, these organizations recognize that focusing on prophetic narratives can hinder peace negotiations and cooperation strategies. Instead of prioritizing practical solutions, some governments and religious leaders persist in rhetoric that highlights the inevitability of conflict, obstructing diplomatic and humanitarian initiatives. For these organizations, the challenge is to develop approaches that respect religious traditions without reinforcing apocalyptic interpretations that perpetuate violence and fear. The importance of a balanced and critical perspective becomes evident when considering the practical consequences of exaggerated apocalyptic interpretations. In regions already marked by instability, reinforcing a fatalistic narrative only exacerbates living conditions and deepens humanitarian crises. Prophecies, when responsibly interpreted, can inspire hope and promote values such as compassion and justice. However, when manipulated to justify hostilities, they lose their spiritual uplifting power and contribute to a cycle of fear and violence. Faced with these challenges, the responsibility falls on religious leaders, politicians, and opinion makers to influence how the public interprets biblical prophecies. Promoting a balanced interpretation that respects the context and symbolism of the scriptures can open pathways for dialogue and encourage the pursuit of peaceful solutions. Encouraging the public to view Revelation as a reflection on human struggles rather than a literal description of future events offers an alternative to fear, transforming it into an opportunity for spiritual and personal growth. By analyzing the connections between biblical prophecies about the Euphrates River and Armageddon and the tensions in the Middle East, we see that these interpretations impact not only spiritual matters, but also political and social dynamics. The influence of apocalyptic visions affects regional dynamics and reinforces stances that often perpetuate conflict. On the other hand, a symbolic reading of prophecies suggests that the battles described in Revelation represent spiritual challenges rather than literal predictions. This approach fosters values of cooperation, compassion, and justice instead of division and fear. Social media also contributes to spreading alarmist interpretations, increasing public anxiety and obscuring the pursuit of real solutions. Adopting a balanced perspective on the scriptures allows us to understand the impact of prophecies in a more constructive way, prioritizing peace and stability. This critical perspective helps recognize religion as a force that can promote cooperation and understanding among nations. Instead of predictions of destruction, biblical prophecies can become invitations for reflection on respect and peace, encouraging more harmonious and responsible coexistence in the modern world.